Hello everyone. We're going to continue this week with our discussion on the development of the English colonies over here in the New World. Now, as you recall, the driving force behind creating colonies of any kind was the idea of mercantilism, that the power of a country was based off of how much gold or how much treasure it could have in its treasury, and that determined how powerful it was. And so the English colonies, as they are starting to develop and to gain cash crops, they are going to bring in profits for the mother country, and that was one of the really big things about mercantilism. Well, because of this, England wanted to make sure that all of the profits came through England, and so they're going to establish the Navigation Acts in 1651, which required that everything coming out of the colonies would go through England and come back through England on the way back to the colonies, so that the English could get their share of the profits off of what the colonies had earned off their goods. Now, so far in our discussion, we've talked mostly about the Virginia and Maryland colonies, which is the Chesapeake region, and the New England colonies. So today I'm going to talk some about the other colonies. First off, you have New York. Now, as we know, New York starts off as New Amsterdam and New Netherlands, but in 1664, Britain is going to be able to gain the New York colony from the Dutch, and this is during the time of the Duke of York, and so that's why it's going to be named New York State and New York City. The basic economy of New York is going to be commerce. It's got that wonderful port there, and so from that point onward to even today, you have got all the goods coming into and out of North America going through the port of New York. By the time we get to the 1700s, the majority of New York is going to be controlled by 5 families. But as the population grows, these are Britons who have come over with the idea of liberties, and so they're going to demand consent to be taxed. They are going to want the same civil liberties that they had enjoyed over in Great Britain as well. Now, another part of the English colonies that are going to develop during this time are going to be the Carolinas. Now, the Carolinas were at one time all together. It wasn't North Carolina, South Carolina to begin with, and they were created as a buffer between Virginia and the in Spanish Florida. A lot of the people that are brought in from the West Indies. So you're going to have a lot of slaves that are going to come up into the Carolina area. In the Carolinas, you're also going to have religious tolerance. They are going to, yes, they're going to have taxes for the church to support the clergy, but there's not going to be that restriction on you have to be Church of England. While that is the state-run church, you don't have to be a member of that to be able to be a viable part of the colony in the Carolinas. They are also going to have an elected assembly, and they're also going to use the headright system to promote coming over and settling the land from the Englishmen over in England. Another colony that's going to develop that's going to allow for religious tolerance is going to be Pennsylvania. William Penn is awarded a land grant from the King of England in payment of a debt owed to his father. And so he's going to come over. He is going to bring his Quaker beliefs with him. Quakers believed in a lot of equality. Women were equal to men within the church. Men of more wealth did not think that they were better than the other men who had less wealth. So you didn't see people tipping their hats to each other in reference to a higher rank. They were also very much pacifist. That means that they did not believe in war. If you have seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge, You know, it's about a gentleman who wants to fight for his country during World War II, or wants to be a part of the war effort, but he doesn't want to kill people. It's part of his belief system, and he's pacifist. So he is going to find a different avenue. He's going to be a corpsman and wind up saving a whole battalion from attack, dragging them out under fire, the wounded, and getting them to safety. So the Quakers are going to develop Pennsylvania. They are going to have lots of different other belief systems in Pennsylvania. You're going to have the Dutch Reformed Church. You're going to have Amish and Mennonite. You're going to have a German belief systems, Presbyterians. And so the Pennsylvania colony is going to be very tolerant of other groups. They also believe that it's proper to buy land from the Native Americans instead of just coming in and stealing their land. So you're going to find that your middle colonies, whether it's Pennsylvania, Delaware, New York, Maryland, they're going to have a lot more diversity when it comes to the different religious beliefs and different peoples coming in. So I want to show you this map of the settlement of Eastern North America. And as you can see from the map, most of it is English. You have the Dutch right here. Here's the French. It kind of gives you an idea where everybody is. And then the Spanish are way down here. They had maintained Spanish Florida for quite some time, ever since the first explorers came over with Ponce de Leon. Now, there's one bit of trivia that I also want to make sure I leave you guys with before we go on to a different part, and that is the Dutch settlers that stay in New York after it is taken over by the British. These are going to be called the Knickerbocker families. And so these are the original Dutch settlers. If you could trace your heritage back to these original Dutch settlers, you were known as the Knickerbockers in New York City. And that is why today we have a basketball team called the New York Knicks. Now, the next item we want to talk about is slavery in the colonies. Slavery took on a different form in North America than it did in most other places. In a lot of other places where slavery had been practiced around the world, a slave would work for their master during the day and be able to go home to their families at night. They were allowed to marry. They were allowed to have some kind of normalcy in their life. In North America, it's not going to be that way. It's going to be called chattel slavery, and it's going to be more and more associated with the slave being the property of the master and losing their identity as a person. It doesn't start off that way. The original slave labor to start with is going to be indentured servants. But indentured servants can buy their way out of slavery. They can earn their way out of it. And there's going to be lots of slaves that are going to come over originally in the early 1600s that are going to be able to work their way out of slavery. Even black slaves that are going to be able to work for their freedom, and they're going to acquire land, and they're going to become plantation owners, and they're going to own slaves themselves. Slavery was a status symbol, much like owning a very expensive car today is a status symbol. Back in the day, the more slaves you owned, the more money you had, and therefore the more status you had. But slavery in North America is going to kind of get a slow start. Number one, you've already got the indentured servants doing the job that you need to be done at the time, but also buying slaves was extraordinarily expensive, and they had a tendency to die quickly. And so because of the high death rate and the high cost, it's going to take a little bit for slavery to take root in North America. Unlike it did in the West Indies, down in the Caribbean, it just kind of exploded because of the need for labor on the sugar plantations on the islands and later in the mines in Central America. And so, but as slavery does begin to grow, then it is going to start being regulated. Your first slave codes are going to start in the 1600s, where even if a mixed marriage, so you have a white and a black marrying together, and they had a child, well, the child would follow the status of the mother. So if the mother was a slave, then the child would be a slave. And so, even in Louisiana today, I think it's still on birth certificates that if you are 125%, like 125% black, it shows up as black on your birth certificate. So they, started, controlling what slaves did, and as time goes on, these slave codes are going to become more and more and more restrictive. The reason that the colonists are going to move away from indentured servants and towards slaves has to do with the fact that indentured servants, as they gained their freedom, started causing trouble. They're going to gain land. They're going to start expecting rights and privileges, as they probably should. But when they don't get them, then they're going to rise up in rebellion. So the most prominent one of the day is going to be Bacon's Rebellion. So if you look here on the map, you can see that this part right here where the pink and the yellow come together, that is the western part of Virginia. Okay, so it's not way over here where it is today. It's right here at the Appalachian Mountains. And as the indentured servants gain their freedom, they move this direction. Well, they start bumping into the Native Americans, and it starts causing attacks and problems and conflicts. And so the freedmen, as they're called, want protection from the governor over here in Colonial Williamsburg, Governor Berkeley. Well, Governor Berkeley says, I don't want to mess with you guys. You created your problem. You guys go fix it. And so he doesn't send any help. And so Nathaniel Bacon is going to gather up these indentured servants, and they are former indentured servants, and they're going to rise up in rebellion against Governor Berkeley. Now, yes, it is going to be put down. Bacon's Rebellion is one of those first big conflicts between the backcountry settlers and the coastal elites. So everyone that had already settled over here along the eastern seaboard, they were considered elites. They had been there a while. They had gotten well established by the late 1600s. And so they had power over the new landowners that had moved further in. So due to these kinds of problems with former indentured servants, you're going to find this move away from indentured service towards buying slaves, because slaves were always going to be a slave. They could not, by this time weren't able to earn their freedom, so it looked like it was more profitable to buy your labor instead of renting your labor. Now, at the same time as all this is going on in North America, you have got the Glorious Revolution going on over in Great Britain. Now, the Glorious Revolution is when they run out James II and they establish William and Mary of Orange as the new monarch. And this is going to cause changes over here in the New World as well. You're going to start having colonial assemblies establishing more authority over the royal governors. You're going to have all kinds of colonial assemblies up and down the line. In Maryland, there's going to be an uprising. They're going to overthrow Lord Baltimore. You have Leisler's Rebellion, who was a Calvinist, and he's going to take control of New York. Up in New England, you're going to have non-Puritans gaining power, which is going to really freak out the Puritans. But also during this time is when you're going to have the Salem witch trials. In 1690, you have some teenage girls that have gotten hysterical over a story that a slave woman has been telling them, and they're going to accuse her of witchcraft. By the time all of this is over, you're going to have 19 people hung for witchcraft in the New England area because of the hysteria of some teenage girls. And so today, when we use the term witch hunt, we are basically referring to that hysteria where you go after someone who is innocent and blame them for things based off of hysteria. Now, I want to change the slide here so you can see the new influx of what North America looks like. With this particular graph, you can see that there are people from Africa, Ireland, Germany, England and Wales, Scotland, and other parts. Some coming as slaves, some as indentured servants, some even as convicts. I'll talk more about that when we get later on into the establishment of Georgia, and then how many came over as free. So with this great migration and the 70,000 immigrants that are coming over during this time, by the time we get into the 1700s, North America is quite a diverse society. Some of the ones coming over are Scots-Irish, not Scotch. Scotch is a drink. Scots are what you call people from Scotland, and they're going to be coming in, and they're going to settle along the back country as well. Your Germans are going to come over. Germans tended to come over as entire families, much like the Puritans did, but it's also going to bring a whole lot of religious diversity. So you're going to have the German churches like Lutheran. You're going to have Presbyterian. You're going to have the Dutch Reformed Church. So all these different religions are also going to come over and mostly going to settle in the middle areas. Some of the things that attract settlers to coming over is going to be the availability of land. Owning land has always been a key to wealth. And so you have the availability of land, you have the lack of a military draft. You did not have to serve in the military over here. And then you have free enterprise. There are not constraints on your ability to be able to build your own economy and become quite wealthy. And so as the colonies start developing, then you can see how the diversity is going to increase the number of settlers, the different ethnicities of the settlers. I want to show you this next map, and it shows you the breakdown of ethnic diversity along the 13 colonies. And if you look at the graph, the legend here, you can see that there are lots of different groups that have settled along all the English colonies, not just people from London area. As the free enterprise grows, it's going to lead to expanded trade with the Native Americans. And so you're going to have traders and farmers who are going to view the Native Americans differently, but there's going to be a rapid growing trade network, especially as you have the Native Americans being almost forced into contact with the Europeans as they start to move over. This is also going to create a class of individuals in the New World who have a sense of prosperity that they never could have possibly achieved over in Europe or over in Great Britain. They have land now, and they have the ability to take the work of their labor and trade with others and amass great wealth over here. Your colonial cities are also going to start to grow. Places like Philadelphia, New York, Boston are going to grow as huge trade centers. Artisans are going to find markets for their goods, and so there's going to be a lot of consumer goods that are also going to be made over here. But it's mostly going to be cottage industries, things where women are going to work out of their home, craftsmen are going to work out of their sheds and their farms, and so there's not yet a lot of commercial type of industry. Your farming still is mostly subsistence farming. They're going to grow enough crops for themselves and to sell to their local neighbors. We're not yet into commercial farming. Now, as I talked about at the beginning of class, this is the time of mercantilism and the time of the Navigation Acts. But at this time, England is going to practice something called salutary neglect. They're not going to enforce the Navigation Acts. And so the colonists at this time are not really going to complain too much about the Navigation Acts and any kind of trade restrictions, because to a large extent it's going to help their economy and not hurt their economy. So the next slide I want to show you is one that shows you the benefits and the drawbacks of mercantilism for the colonists. They are wanting to establish a favorable balance of trade. They want things to come back to benefit the mother country. And so the Navigation Acts and this mercantilism are going to benefit the colonies. Now, the drawbacks are that the colonists could not trade anywhere they wanted to. They had to go through England. It's going to cause a lot of smuggling and a lot of what they call rum running when they would try to get away with not going through Mother England. So as the economy in the New World starts to grow, you're going to start having people gain in prosperity. It's going to create a colonial elite. So you're going to have a powerful upper class of merchants. But America had no titled aristocracy, and that's really a good thing. Later on, when we get into the early 1800s, I'll tell you about a Frenchman that comes over and talks about the lack of a titled aristocracy. And it's going to lead to more and more people being able to gain wealth. In Virginia, you're going to have a group called the FFV. These are the First Families of Virginia, and by the time we get to 1770, most of them have inherited their wealth from their family that came over before them. They're also going to live a lifestyle that is going to become more and more of an American identity and less of a European identity. You also didn't have as much poverty over here as they had over in England. Yes, there were some who were tenant farmers and indentured servants. I mean, not everybody was wealthy, but there was a standard of living over here in the New World and in the English colonies that most of these people never could have achieved if they had stayed back in England. You get down into South Carolina, and in South Carolina, it was the richest group of mainland colonists. And I mean, so many people owned land, and that was so much a gauge of wealth. I mean, even currently, my father was of that mindset that wealth indicated wealth. I mean, sorry, that land indicated wealth. And so he would just buy land so that he would have it. He bought almost 6 or 7 acres of land out in the El Paso area that they had told him was going to be prosperous and going to turn a pretty dollar. And 60 years later, we sold it as tumbleweeds and sand. And so, but it was that idea that if you had land, then you had wealth. He also bought a swamp in Florida. It's still a swamp in Florida. We can't sell it. And so the idea that you have land, even currently, is an indicator that you have wealth. Now, we've talked quite a bit about the wealthy and about the poor, but there was also a growing middle class of people in the country that had some land. They were yeoman farmers, so they farmed their own land. They didn't have slaves coming in. They just farmed their own land. Artisans. So you have a growing middle class as well. Women were a large part of this, but this is the rise of what's known as the cult of domesticity. This idea that men and women had separate spheres, that it was man's job to go off and bring home the bacon. And back in this time period, you really brought home the bacon because it was an animal. But now it means that you're bringing home the money. And so the man went out and worked, and the woman stayed home, had the children, educated them in the home, kept the house, did all of the labor there with the house, kept the small garden. And so you have these separate spheres. The man was the total head of the household, and the woman was subservient to him. You also have the decrease in the infant mortality rate. So as more children are surviving infancy, now mom is got her hands full taking care of numerous numbers of children. So this wraps up chapter 3 in your textbook, but I want to go back, and I want to go back into your notes and talk about some of the questions that are within your period 2 notes. Now, in your notes, about halfway through, you've got the question I used as the example last class on how to answer a short answer question. And I'm hoping that at this point you now have the information to be able to fill that information in these boxes. The easiest way to be able to practice short answer questions or quiz questions and be able to fill in your notes is to do it in the same format. So, to what extent did religious belief determine the character of the 13 colonies? So you're going to want to identify it, you want to define it, you want to tie it back to the prompt. So as I used in my example last week, like New England, an example of religion in New England is going to be the Puritans. The Puritans were a group of intensely religious people who believed they were going to set up the pure church on earth and establish a whole new religion over here in the New World. This is going to shape the character of their colony by creating the church as the center of everything, and that to the point where you even had to be a church member to vote and could get kicked out if you disagreed with the church. And so you want to do the same thing with the middle colonies. Now the middle colonies, if you look at the chart I've given you about the religious diversity, you're going to see that the middle colonies had lots of diversity. So that question's going to be different. You're not going to have one belief system to pick on or talk about. So you're going to talk about that they believed in religious tolerance and how that affected their colony. And then when you get talking about the southern colonies, yes, it's the Anglican Church, but everybody went to church, but it did not dictate how their colony ran. And so you want to talk about it in that fashion for that question. And so just keep in mind that you're in response to these, you're going to have at least three sentences. You're going to have a sentence that's going to identify what it is, a sentence that's going to define what that identity is, and then a sentence on how that ties back to the prompt that was given to you. Now, another piece in your notes on the next page is the similarities and the differences between the Chesapeake colonies and the New England colonies. So you're talking about the colonies of Virginia and Maryland, so that's the Chesapeake colonies, and how they were alike or different than the New England colonies, which is going to be Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Rhode Island, that section. And so you want to look first off at who came over. So in both instances, you have got Englishmen that are coming over. So that's how they're similar. How they're different. In the Chesapeake colonies, it's going to be mostly single young men, a lot of them poor, very few women. In the New England colonies, it's going to be mostly family groups and in large numbers. Okay. Another difference, they're both groups, or another similarity, sorry, both groups are going to be Christian groups, but you have the Anglicans in the South that are not intensely religiously motivated, whereas you have the Puritans up in the New England colonies that everything revolves around what the church did or did not do. Another similarity is that both sets of both the New England area and the Chesapeake area are going to go through a struggle when they first come in. But you have the camaraderie, the community togetherness of New England that's going to help them get on their feet faster. Down in your Chesapeake colony, it's more of an every man for himself type of attitude, and so they're going to struggle longer than they do up in the north. Now, the importance in knowing how to fill in your notes, how to do more than just take what I've handed you. You want to take the knowledge that I'm espousing, the information I'm giving you, and you want to make it your own. You don't want to have it to be something that you just possess for a little while. You want to own it. And so by writing about it, by rewriting it in your own words, doing something with it than just having it on the paper is going to take information that is that you've rented and making it something that you've owned. And that's why it's important to go back and to do the pieces that are in your notes. Now, I'm not going to go further into the notes tonight because there are other things I want to talk about out of next week's notes that will help with the rest of it. But let's talk for a minute about your discussion boards. I know I put a blurb on there on how to do your discussion board, but I want to kind of go over that. So for each one of those thought questions, I want you to write a thoughtful response to it. It needs to be 3 or 4 sentences that answers the question. And then I want you to find one of your classmates' responses and reply back to them. Add to it, expand upon it. Don't just say, oh yeah, I agree with you, and then go on. Give it some thought and make this a conversation between the class, because we can't all meet together, so that we can, expound upon the information and make it more than just black and white letters on a piece of paper. Next week, I am going to be going further, and kind of wrapping up the rest of the colonial period and how we go from being very, very happy Englishmen to wanting to go to war with the mother country. And so that's the next step in our series. And so I will see you next week. Have a good one. Bye.